Well, all of you understand why we immediately jumped at that chance to get him back here for our June 1 meeting. He was in town and he received an award for his fight for freedom and everything he's doing there from the American Freedom Alliance along with Daniel Horowitz. And that was they had back on May 21. Geert Wilders came over from Holland to he was the keynote speaker for that event. It's certainly a well-deserved award. Mr. Haney started his life as an entomologist, as a bug scientist. And he worked extensively in the Middle East. And he learns the language there, he reads, writes, and speaks Arabic, knows the culture there, and he understands Islam from his many years of interacting with the people, not just in the big cities, not the elites, but out there in the villages, where he would do a lot of his work. When the Department of Homeland Security opened, he was a founding member of that. With his knowledge of the area, of the culture, of the religion, he was a natural fit for that department. And he moved up and he was assigned as an intelligence analyst what they call the National Targeting Center. And his job was to connect the proverbial dots and try to anticipate in advance and prevent another 9/11 or other terrorist attacks by analyzing that intelligence. And he was very good at that. He identified successfully more than 300 terrorists before they struck. Unfortunately, he was too good at that for the Obama administration. And I'm sure he'll tell you more about his history with the department and how they forced him to delete his data, including he was tracking the Tablighi Jamaat network, a jihadist network based in Central Asia. Turns out that the mosque that the San Bernardino terrorists attended was part of that network. But in 2012, representatives of Hillary Clinton's State Department came over and stopped his investigation into Tablighi Jamaat, and to wonder why that happened. They pressured him, they investigated him, they threatened him with legal action, and ultimately accepted early retirement, which didn't get him out of their hair, because he's been traveling the country ever since, telling the story. He's written a book, we have copies of it up here called See Something, Say Nothing, and how to celebrate and autograph those. And we're taking a sign. There's more people that want his book than we have books here. We're going to take a sign-up list. You can have the book shipped to my office. He will autograph them there, and you can come to my office in Redlands and pick up your book. So I definitely recommend that book to you. And as I said before, he was on the Unite IE radio, so if you think that his message tonight is something that your friends, relatives, co-workers should hear, encourage them to tune in, send them the podcast when it's posted early next week. And also, there's going to be a special briefing tomorrow. So if you have someone like your pastor, somebody you have a connection with who might want to hear this message but wouldn't want to come to a public Tea Party meeting, talk to me afterwards and we'll get you the information so we get these great speakers to come here, including Philip Haney. We had Robert Spencer a while back. And we had good information from them, but most of the people who attended this meeting already basically understand the threat of Islamic terrorism and the jihad. It's the people that don't come to this meeting, these type of meetings, that really should hear his message. And tomorrow was an attempt to do that, send up the podcast, and also Sam and Bay. They take some pictures. Sam is making a video that's going to be on our YouTube channel, Redlands Tea Party Patriots #1. So you need to encourage people to send that video once it's posted. Post it on your own Facebook pages and try to get his word out to the people that aren't in this room. Few people would have, and he'll tell you his story, would have the courage and fortitude to stand up to the kind of pressure that the government can bring on you when they're investigating you and threatening you with criminal action, sending you to prison. And he stood his ground and continued to try to get the truth out, which he knew and was trying to convey to members of Congress and to the public. So, enough of me. I will bring up a great leader and patriot and hero of the cause of freedom, Philip Haney.
You know, it's not very difficult to do the right thing when you know what the right thing is. And it's really easy to get distracted about what we're fighting against and forget what we're fighting for. So what are we fighting for? Yes, the Republic that was founded on the principles of the Constitution. Before I go on, though, I wanted to compliment Denise, Louise. Took a lot of courage not only to come up and stand before a group of people, but also to take on the assignment of marching against one of the most ominously dangerous forces that operates in the world today. Do you know what ominous force I'm referring to? So why, in a nutshell, is Sharia law an ominous force? Taking away all of the little subtleties and fine points. By the way, Sharia law is not an abstract thing. It's an actual book. Just like the Constitution itself, or state and federal civil law are in a book. And you can literally set them on the table side by side. We're not arguing about something that's abstract. We're arguing about actual words on paper that outline law. So what is the most fundamental threat about Sharia law, aside from all the fine points? That is that it's a violation of Article 6 of the Constitution. Article 6 of the Constitution says that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. By its own self-definition, Sharia law is superior to all other man-made forms of law. And that's not sort of or kind of, that is an absolute certainty, an emphatic legal point, based on 1,400 years of history, that the only source of peace from the Islamic perspective is whenever Sharia law is implemented around the entire world. And up until that time, there will be no peace. And if nations and tribes and tongues don't submit to the wisdom and authority of the Sharia law voluntarily, they will be forced to do it involuntarily. Are you following me? So when you enter into a spiritual arena, a battleground like this, it's really important to understand what exactly is it that you're fighting for, as well as what you're fighting against. I also wanted to compliment Susan, you know, because between Denise and Susan and everyone else here, what you have is a portrait of what's going on across the country. There's an overarching gravitational force that opposes the things that we were granted or endowed by our Creator, those inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that are grounded in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That's what makes our country unique. Despite what our former president said, the reason why America is unique because it embodies in its founding doctrines principles that are self-evident in the creation itself, that we have been endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the things that our country was founded on. That's why this country that is of, for, and by the people is so unique in the history of the world. The only ever country that ever really approached anywhere near what America is was Israel in its best times, perhaps under David the king, or Solomon, when they were actually, or Hezekiah, one of the biblical kings, when they were actually following as close as they were capable of doing the laws that were embodied in the Torah. There's been no other country in the history of the world that's come anywhere near to that principle other than America because of the principles that our country was founded on. That's why our country our system is of, for, and by the people. Even its very best, The federal government and or the state government, at least some state governments, are only capable of reaching out so far. And if the challenges that we face at the grassroots level here in this area of California and across the whole rest of the country are not faced and directly taken on by the people at the ground level, then there's nothing really that the federal government can do, because they can only reach out so far. And they can't come in with a magic easy button and solve the challenges that we face at grassroots level across the country. But if the people, of, for, and by the people, address the nature of the challenges at that level, then with the cooperation, hopefully, of a functioning federal and or state government, there can actually be successful effort, after all, to preserve the liberties that we were endowed by our Creator. By the way, according to the Constitution, the Creator himself instituted government among men. Therefore, I would hope, at least among those in the faith community, that the debate about whether we should be involved in a system that protects us should be over. Because if you believe in the Creator, then you must also by default recognize that He instituted government among men in order to implement, or I should say, protect the liberties that He endowed us with. So it's basically a no-brainer. It should be. And the basis of our elections going forward, I would hope, will not be on partisan issues, whether a person has a D or an R after their name, but whether or who is more likely to uphold the principles of the Constitution that our country is founded on. In other words, it should be a pretty easy choice to make between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Not based on personality, either the good qualities or the quirks or the faults in the person's personality, as much as who is more likely, based on past behavior, to be upholding the principles of the Constitution. Who is more likely to be upholding the principles of the Constitution in this last election? Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? What did Huffington Post say Donald Trump's chances of winning the election were on the morning of the election? 2%. 2 out of 100. I was in Omaha, Nebraska, the morning of the election, or I should say the evening, and I was thinking about this as we were watching the replay of the Star-Spangled Banner. You notice that it starts out with a question. "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light?" It's a question. "What so proudly we hail by the twilight's last gleaming." What is he talking about there? He's talking about the citizens of Baltimore who were up on the roofs of their houses in a driving rainstorm, all watching the battle between the British fleet and the soldiers of Fort McHenry. When I was a kid, I did not realize, I wasn't taught specifically, that on each left and right flank of Fort McHenry were 2 large batteries of 20,000-pound cannons, bigger than telephone poles. And that in the front were a large battery of 50,000-pound cannons that were big enough that you could put your head in the bore of the cannon. And I know that's true because I did it. I was curious. And I put my head inside the cannon just to see how big those things really were. So it wasn't a passive battle. The soldiers of America were defending themselves against the British fleet, and therefore the British fleet had to anchor just out of lethal range in order to prevent being sunk themselves. Therefore, it was a stalemate. But in this case, the stalemate was as good as a victory because they withdrew. And in the morning, as the dawn rose, by the way, if you go to Fort McHenry, the landscape looks virtually identical today as it did back then. And you can see exactly the layout of the land and how the British fleet had to park offshore because you can't sail and fire. You have to be stationary. So all they could really do was lob the shells into the fort and hoping they got a lucky shot. But they didn't, and they had to withdraw. By the way, anybody here that may be familiar with the Chesapeake Bay knows that it's a labyrinth of sandbars and places just ready to devour ships whole. It's one of the most treacherous areas in the world to navigate through. So how did the British fleet get from the Atlantic Ocean into the Baltimore Harbor? With loyalists, meaning loyalists to the King George, which means Americans who were on the side of the British, who were helping the British captains navigate the fleet right up to the doorstep of Fort McHenry. In other words, it was a civil war. It was more than what we think of as a fight between the Americans and the British. It was a fight between Americans and Americans, or people living here. Some who were loyalists and some who were colonialists. So it was actually a three-way war. And then we had another one called the War Between the States. And then we have another one now. And that is, we have a civil war. It's a constitutional crisis. And what I mean by that is we have joined the battle, because in truth, the election of Donald Trump really just did one thing, and that is define the battlefield more clearly than we ever saw it before. And if you think that the people who are shouting no walls, no borders, or resist, or not our president, if you think that is ugly in the way they behave, you should know that it was already there. It was been there quite a long time. But those people operated with the luxury of cover from the previous administration. Now, if they intend to accomplish the goals that they say they hold so dearly, they are now forced to come out into the open and operate without camouflage. And so what you're actually seeing is no different than what was there before. It's just that they're now forced to come out in the open. Kind of like a forest in the winter, when all the leaves fall off and you can see the objects that are otherwise camouflaged during the summer. Now we can see them. So what are we going to do with this opportunity? Meaning, we see the clearly defined battlefield. What are we going to do? There are three arenas, by the way, if you're not sure what arena you might be operating in. The three arenas are the social arena. The social arena flashpoint for that is immigration reform. We already see in the media virtually every day why I call it a flashpoint. Because every single effort by either federal or state government to help reform an immigration law for the basis of safety for our own citizens is met with fierce resistance. Is that right? That's a flashpoint. They say that we need immigration because to increase diversity and inclusion, without regard to the possible threat of not even knowing who people are. The second arena with the flashpoint is the political arena. And this touches on what she said earlier about sovereignty. The whole argument, for example, of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem isn't so much about the physical location of the embassy. It's about the sovereign right of one country to establish a relationship with another country as they see fit. And the entire world is telling America and Israel, you do not have the right to establish a political relationship based on your sovereignty. We're going to tell you what you can or cannot do. And the third arena is the law enforcement-military arena. And the flashpoint for that one is going to be the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Everything else is secondary, because until we come to the point where we have the wherewithal to recognize the nature of the threat that we face right in front of us, that's clearly identified in their own words what their intention is, which is in Arabic, al-Mutsima al-Islamiyya al-Qaeda, and I'll say it again, al-Mutsima al-Islamiyya al-Qaeda. You hear a word in there? In English, it's the observant Muslim base. Doesn't sound so ominous in English, does it? Necessarily. You can water ski right over the top of it and miss it. But the base in Arabic is Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda is not an organization, it's a concept. The observant Muslim base, and that's the point of immigration. Did you know that according to the Quran, a Muslim immigrant who comes to a new land receives the same reward in heaven as the mujahideen, the one with the gun or the sword? Did you know that? It's true. That means that people that immigrate to other countries for the sake of Allah, fi sabil Allah, are not doing it to learn to like hot dogs and watermelon. They're doing it because they have a full expectation of receiving the same reward in heaven as their brethren who are fighting on the battlefield. That's an entirely different way of looking at the immigration dynamic, wouldn't you say? With the expectation of receiving a reward in heaven, the same reward that those who fight on the battlefield receive, because it's a form of jihad to immigrate to new non-Muslim lands. And what is the purpose of the immigration? What is the purpose of the jihad? Implementation of Sharia law, so that the deen of Allah yakhatun fil al-ard, so that the law of Allah will be supreme in all of the earth. That is in Quran chapter 2, verse 191. That is the stated strategy of the global Islamic movement, is to implement Sharia law everywhere on the face of the earth. In the Bible, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight. So put away your sword, because those who live by the sword will die by the sword." But according to Islam, Allah's kingdom is of this world. Therefore, the servants of Allah do fight. Exactly the opposite of the message of the Bible, of Christianity. And Allah's servants are fighting. Does anyone know why the U.S. Constitution was built? Remember that? Old Ironsides? That's right. It was built to confront the Barbary pirates. Who were they? Yes. They were. Remember what their port, the name of their port was? Tripoli. Yeah, somebody said it. So our forefathers built the USS Constitution to protect the U.S. Constitution. They sailed a ship over there and they bombarded the fortress in Tripoli and repatriated a ship called the Philadelphia, which ended up being burned in the harbor, but they repatriated the crew. Did you know that they captured American sailors and sold them into slavery? And that we spent 25% of our GNP the first few years of our infancy as a nation were paying ransom to Barbary pirates for ship, cargo, or crew, and then many of them never came back again? And that's why the Founding Fathers built that ship. It was impervious to cannon fire, conventional warfare, and sailed right up directly into the face of the fortress in Tripoli and bombarded it and broke the back of the slave trade, which had been going on for more than 1,000 years. Who drove the slave trade? Muslims. Where are the descendants of the slaves in the Western Hemisphere? Everywhere you look. Where are the descendants of the slaves in the Eastern Hemisphere? They don't exist. The Muslims drove the slave trade in Africa for 1,000 years. Infamous places like Zanzibar, with the ghosts of 10 million slaves buried in those places where they captured them, then sold them on the market. And eventually the UK came into the trade and started buying and selling. They would sail to America, drop off the slaves, and buy cotton from the South and take it back to London or UK for their garment industry. And that's how it worked. It was a triangle. Africa, America, UK, like this. So Amazing Grace, you know the story of the song, was written by a person who tried to break the slave trade, and actually he was successful. That's a little bit of a side note, but the point is that is legal under Sharia law, slavery, whatever your right hand possesses. And that includes women, meaning sex slaves. That's also legal. There's also a thing called nikah, which allows you to have intercourse with a woman and say that you're married with her, and as soon as you're finished, you divorce her. And so is female genital mutilation, which is now emerging itself into our culture. And the defense of the doctors in Minnesota that our guest spoke of earlier is that it's part of her cultural religious practice, so therefore it should be protected. This is what I mean, friends, by a civil war vis-a-vis our Constitution. I was in Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Wisconsin in March, and I told the people there, watch out for the emergence of FGM, female genital mutilation, and most of the people in the audience had not yet heard of it. And I don't like being right about these kind of things, but sadly, within 2 months after I was there, the big case with the doctor in Michigan broke, and now her defense is going to be that it's part of her religious and cultural experience. Meanwhile, it's broken out in Maine now. There's another case going forward where the state legislature in Maine has become afraid to pass a law against it because they don't want to be seen as racist and discriminatory. So whose rights are they actually watching out for? By the way, I have a PowerPoint. In fact, I think the title of my talk is Draining the Swamp. But I know we're limited on time, and every time I appear and talk, they're never the same twice. But what you can do is just contact your coordinator, and he will send you a copy of the PowerPoint.
Philip, take your time.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have to take it? Huh? Okay, just push it. Just keep going. Well, let's stop there. There are valves that are open that should be closed, and valves that are closed that should be open. The valves that are open are leaks. And the valves that are closed are the ones that would bring fresh water into the swamp. There are a lot of mutant creatures in that swamp we're discovering, aren't we? There's also a lot of stuff that in the middle of the night, people within the Obama administration would row that boat out into the middle of the swamp and dump this stuff over the side, thinking that they'd never see it again. And they did that habitually for year after year after year, and there are all kinds of incriminating pieces of evidence that are sunk down into the mud and goo at the bottom of that swamp. And so simply draining the water off the swamp is only the merest first step. Then we have to have people that are willing to go into that environment, that toxic environment, with the stench to heaven, because it will stink, and bring all that stuff up out of the mud and clean it off and then look at it and evaluate it from a law enforcement perspective, and then take action based on that. And people should and will, if President Trump does follow through, go to jail, because they abrogated their constitutional duty, and they sold themselves out for short-gain profit at the expense of the welfare of our country. And you may think that I'm exaggerating or overstating, but I saw these people eye to eye, face to face, sitting literally next to them in their offices with my computer, looking at a PowerPoint of classified information showing them exactly what the nature of the people that are running these organizations that are operating openly in front of us to this very day really were. And I would look at them directly, and I'm talking expressions that only their family would see. This is not a media moment, this is not a photo op. This is color draining out of people's faces that you see on TV regularly. Knowing at that moment, in a clear-eyed moment of discernment, that what I was telling them was absolutely true, and then I could see the process. Them going through the decision-making process, whether they were going to respond to it and uphold their vow to protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic, or they were going to turn their face away. And I'm sad to say, even with people with R's after their name, that virtually all of them turn their face away. And I have a saying about history. I say that she is a fearsome woman, and that if history fastens her eye on you, and she finds you on the wrong side of the truth, that she will turn you into stone. And you think of Neville Chamberlain. All of us that remember who Neville Chamberlain is, our immediate mental picture of him standing with that paper, isn't it? That we will have peace in our time. Neville Chamberlain is turned into a stone by history. And there are people that are perilously close to being turned into stones because they knew what the right thing to do was, and they chose to not do it, to not follow through with the very reason that they were elected to be there in the first place. If you want an example, you know who Judicial Watch is, correct? They just released a report, Bill Marshall, today. They found something like 1,300 more pages of classified documents that were being exchanged between Hillary Clinton and Huma Abedin. Remember Huma Abedin?
Never.
Do you remember the 5 members of the House that wrote letters to the IGs of 5 different agencies, simply expressing their concern about the possible influence of the Muslim Brotherhood within the branches of government? It was in June of 2012, 5 years ago. Any of you recall that? Do you recall the reaction from people like Boehner and McCain and Rogers, who publicly criticized Michelle Bachmann in particular for being defaming the patriotic Ms. Huma Abedin? And what they did is they interjected themselves into the checks and balances form of government they had and abrogated their constitutional duty, a lot like Comey did, and interrupted the process of simply allowing the letters to go forward and let the IGs evaluate and examine whether or not their concerns, meaning the concerns of the 5 members of Congress, were valid or not. 5 years later, it turns out, like the Munchkins say, they were not only merely, but most sincerely right to be concerned. So I wrote an email this morning to Michelle Bachmann and Louis Gohmert and Trent Franks, and I said, I bet you feel a little bit better about those letters that you wrote 5 years ago, don't you? Because the whole thing is about Huma Abedin and Hillary Clinton. That's kind of stuff that's down there in the bottom of the swamp, friends. And we're getting that without really any great degree of cooperation. Can you imagine what would happen if somebody like Secretary Kelly or Tillerson or Sessions gives people like myself the actual deputized mandate to go in and let nothing stop us from digging all this stuff up? We're going to see Actually, you know, I could talk to you for a week. Because there's so much to it. America, all countries, are like sponges floating on a large pool of water. We float around on this water and we kind of bump into each other. And what's the natural thing that happens with sponges and floating on water? They become saturated, don't they? And if left to the natural course of physics, what normally happens to sponges when they stay in the water long enough? They become supersaturated and they just kind of float right there at the surface, submerged, you know, you can kind of see a little bit of the top of them. Well, the dilemma is that we are like a sponge floating on the water, but you cannot take the sponge out of the water because that's the world that we live in. So since we cannot take the sponge out of the water, what can prevent the sponge from being supersaturated as it floats around on the water? And by the way, these are malevolent things that it's being saturated with, like the ideology of the progressive leftists and or the ideology of the global Islamic movement, which oftentimes end up working together, because both of them have a single purpose, a single strategy in mind, and that is to alter or abolish the form of government that we currently live under and replace it with one that is more suitable to their worldview, which is virtually an exact paraphrase of the Declaration of Independence, but in a malevolent context. So if that sponge is being saturated from underneath, and you want to speed up the process, what is one of the things that you will do to that sponge? Push on the top of it. So what is that pushing? That's terrorist attacks. Put pressure on the government, the system, the country, and force or increase, speed up the saturation process. So you have saturation from the bottom up. By the way, I don't use the word infiltration. The reason why is because I call it a Novocaine word. What do I mean by a Novocaine word? Inclusion is a Novocaine word. Diversity is a Novocaine word. It's like your brain gets a shot of Novocaine. Racism is a Novocaine word. Because when you hear it, your mind goes numb, doesn't it? It can't process it. Another way of putting it is like spider bite. The spider bites the fly, and the fly is still alive, but it can't respond to its environment. It's trapped in the net, just waiting for that awful moment when the spider finally decides it's time for dinner. And we have been intoxicated by these kind of things and lost the realization of who we are as a people. And that's why we need a constitutional revival. And what we need to become and yes, I'm a believer, and I also believe in a biblical revival. Is that the Constitution itself is saturated with biblical values. So even if you say you are not a believer, even if you go to the point of saying I'm an atheist, but you are a valiant defender of the Constitution, you by default are defending biblical values. So it's not necessary to argue theology. You're my natural ally. And so I hope that by my example, I will show a person who insists that he's an atheist, by my own behavior and character and integrity, what a person who does believe in the biblical worldview can be like. And meanwhile, as I said to Zudi Jasser one day, you guys know who Zudi is, right? Some of you? He believes it is possible to practice Islam without the influence of Sharia law. He's considered a reformer. But he has a very small voice in a very large world. And as I said to people who are somewhat skeptical of my friendship with him, because I managed to become friends with virtually everybody, is that if we don't work together and address the nature of the threat we face, then we can all argue theology in the gulag, because that's exactly where we'll be. And if Hillary Clinton had won, I can promise you, friends, because I was inside, that meetings like this would be considered on the verge of hate speech. And that people would literally burst through those doors and disrupt, if at the very least, if not cause more disruption. And people like myself would literally be hauled away and charged with hate speech for inciting and provocation, racism, discrimination, and Islamophobia, which is actually a global crime. Did you know that? It's called UN Resolution 1618. It's illegal, according to the resolution passed by the UN and endorsed by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, to criticize Islam. And if you do, it's considered blasphemy in Islamic countries that observe Sharia law. And that's another way of saturating the sponge. So how do we insulate the sponge from being saturated? That's really the question, right? Because we can't take the sponge out of the world, because it's the world we live in. We're out of the water. So if that's the dilemma, then what is the protection against it? Waterproofing. And how do you waterproof the sponge? The Constitution. Article 6 again says that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that the judges of each state will abide thereby. This is not an article, or I should say First Amendment argument. This is an Article 6 issue. But we have never been threatened in the history of our country by another form of law that would have the audacity to actually come in and try to saturate the political, social, and law enforcement arenas of our culture and say so plainly and be astonished probably themselves that the political structure in our country allows them to continue doing it. Because we've been misled to think that the whole issue boils down to the First Amendment, but it doesn't. It's actually an Article 6 issue. There's a big distinction between freedom of speech and expression and worship than a blatant subversion of the U.S. Constitution. And again, I go back to the definition of Sharia itself, which says that it's superior to all man-made forms of law. We need to start taking these things at face value. By the way, President Trump just got back from a tour. He made 4 major speeches: Saudi Arabia, Israel, the West Bank, and to NATO, essentially. And what he basically did is he watched. Everybody knows that if you go somewhere and you visit somebody and you meet them for the first time, they're always more comfortable in their own home. Is that correct? So, very brilliantly, President Trump goes to their own home and meets them on their own turf, their own home ground, and talks to them in an incredibly polite manner. Because we're constantly criticized that we don't respect the religion of peace, that we misrepresent or mischaracterize it and we don't understand it. So what President Trump did is he goes to Saudi Arabia in a meeting attended by the leaders of at least 50 different Muslim countries and says to them, I'm going to give you all respect and honor that a world leader can possibly give. And I want you to take the responsibility for driving out these terrorists from your places of worship, your countries, and the world. And I was struck when you were talking that President Trump's talking about driving out terrorists from the world, and California is busy driving out businesses from its own state. So, but what may be lost is the meaning of the word drive out. Drive out is the verb in the Quran that occurs about 185 times. The verb is kharaj. It rhymes with garage. Just think about this for a minute. He's speaking in English. And then all of a sudden this phrase, drive them out from your masjids, drive them out from your country, drive them out from the world itself, is translated into Arabic. And all of a sudden, these people are like shocked, like I can't tell you, huge shock. Because this word is translated back into a Quranic construct. And they realize that the very verb, kharaj, which means to drive out unbelievers, has now been logged back into their court and puts them in a really incredibly difficult situation. Because now President Trump says, I'm going to give you all deference and courtesy. I'm going to give you a soft serve right into your court. You say that you are the religion of peace. I'm going to give you an opportunity to show the world just what a religion of peace it really is. They are in a huge dilemma, friends. Israel and talking to Netanyahu about the process that we've been going through, peace process. And then he went to Bethlehem and talked to Mahmoud Abbas and confronted him. We all know now, it came out in the headlines, he basically said, you lied to me. I was in Beit Jala when Abbas was talking to President Trump. I'm talking not even a month ago. I was in Israel. in Beit Jala, in the West Bank, watching the TV with Abbas and President Trump. And I heard Abbas say that we raise our children in peace and our grandchildren in peace. While I had just spent the day walking around the streets of Beit Jala taking pictures of murals on the wall dedicated to mujahideen and shaheeds, people who died killing Israelis, freshly painted with the icons of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a globally designated terrorist organization. Right there. And other murals that said the word in Arabic, Sana'ud, which means we will return, with pictures of Palestine with no Israel. This is the reality. And if anyone, us, our president, is going to enter into a discussion about peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's imperative that we not define the discussion based on what we think they see, but base it on exactly the way they see the world, which is a no-state solution. In other words, it's part of the Islamic Waqf, WAQF, means the inheritance of the Islamic global community. There is no place for Israel. I brought a mural of that, or an embroidery that's in my briefcase that shows all the cities of Israel in Arabic. There's no Israel. It's all Palestine. So if you're going to form a foreign policy, you have to base it on the way they see the world, not the way we think they should see it. But that's the way we need to deal with immigration and also counterterrorism here in America. And take these things at face value. Because there's a big difference between strategy and tactics. The strategy of the global Islamic movement is to implement Sharia law everywhere. What's complicated and kaleidoscopic about it is the tactics, how to go about doing it. And that's back to the sponge. One tactic is saturation from the bottom up, and that is the expertise of the Muslim Brotherhood. Council on American-Islamic Relations. Anybody heard of them? Islamic Society of North America. Assembly of Muslim Jurists, AMJA. Who called the election of Donald Trump a calamity, which, if you know that translation from Arabic, that is a call to jihad. This is an organization that in Arabic, or I should say in English, is called the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. But in Arabic, it is called Majama Fuqaha al-Sharia bi-Amrikiya. Majama Fuqaha al-Sharia bi-Amrikiya. A group of lawyers promoting Sharia law in America. Why is that organization even allowed to function here in the United States? But it's doing it openly. And that ties me back to my comment about the law enforcement arena and the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood. The reason why we need to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, because some components of the groups are openly promoting Sharia law. And they called the election of Donald Trump a calamity. And if you want to, you can go on the web, look up an article I wrote. It was posted January 23rd, called The Ominous Roadmap of the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. I posted it 2 days after President Trump was inaugurated. It was the very first subject matter expert level analysis of what to expect from the Muslim global Islamic movement here operating in the United States. And it is a very ominous, thorough written document. There are 14 paragraphs. I walked through and deciphered every one of the connections to the Quran and found 32 verses from the Quran embedded within the language of the English version of this thing called a fatwa. You've heard of a fatwa, right? This is the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, the Majama Fuqaha al-Sharia bi-Amrikiya. Sounds totally different in Arabic, doesn't it? So what it's doing is building on top of this plan that I told you before called the Al-Munsima al-Islamiyya al-Qaeda. They're taking the Muslim Brotherhood's explanatory document foundation and building on top of it to take the next step forward in terms of the overall strategic goal to to implement Sharia law here in the United States. So I really would encourage you to go look it up and take a look and read it through. It's not light reading. It's difficult because it's deep and it's ominous. But this is where we are, friends. We're going to have the courage to address the nature of the threat we face honestly. Otherwise, we have no hope of really recovering ourselves. As Abraham Lincoln said, that we must disenthrall ourselves. He said, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. That the occasion is piled high with difficulties, but we must rise with the occasion. And that as our case is new, so we must think anew and we must act anew. We must all disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country, the last best hope on earth. And I, for one, would love to see some more statesmen rise up among our country who verbalize and express those deep-seated feelings that we share in such carefully worded language, wouldn't you? I talked a little bit about San Bernardino, Syed Farouk, and Tashfeen Malik. Does anybody know where Enrique Marquez is right now? Yeah. You know why he's in jail? I mean, it maybe seem like an obvious question, but it's not quite as obvious as you might think. The reason why he's in jail is for multiple failed plots with Syed Farouk. Well, wait a minute, think about that for a second. What does that mean? Multiple failed plots with Syed Farouk. Wait a minute, Syed Farouk is no longer alive. Which means what? That they were done before he was killed. Which means also what? That he was also on the radar, the FBI radar, before he ever killed the people in San Bernardino. How could you have multiple failed plots unless they were taking place and being planned before the final assault here in San Bernardino? Which only strengthens my premise that if the federal government had not shut down the Tablighi Jamaat case that I worked on at the National Targeting Center and received a commendation for finding 300 terrorists related to the case, 300, and that we had 1,200 law enforcement actions based on that case in the first 9 months that we worked on it, and that the Attorney General of the Department of Homeland Security, I should say Chief Counsel of DHS, authorized the initiative in August of 2011. He gave his imprimatur that it was a legally solid case. Despite all of that, the Department of Homeland Security, Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, plus the State Department, came to the National Targeting Center on March 12th of 2012 and said to our face that they had concerns about our focus on this group called Tablighi Jamaat, because it was not a designated terrorist organization. Therefore, we were likely violating the civil rights and civil liberties and/or the privacy rights of foreign nationals by implying or otherwise suggesting that we might be affiliated with a terrorist organization, which, after all, has not been designated as a terrorist organization. Does that make sense to you? No. And that's why I'm standing in front of you, because it didn't make sense to me either. When I was in high school, my dad told me to take shorthand. I thought he told me that because I was a nerd, you know. And he figured I'd be a better nerd in school if I learned shorthand. But I only found out later the real reason why he told me to take shorthand is so that when I got drafted for the Vietnam War, I'd have clerical skills, and that I might somehow be able to be assigned to some other unit rather than the infantry. But I thank my dad for that advice because it came in very handy as time went on. I took the shorthand like a duck takes to water, and I managed to write down things that people said in meetings like the one that I attended at the National Targeting Center, and wrote down everything that they said. and kept it. And I kept all the other stuff too, 42,000 files. I gave them to Congress, which was my right to do. And I'll finish up, then we have questions. Why did I bring up the Tablighi case? Because nothing in the book that I write about has been resolved to this day. Among them is the reasons, the decisions, the policies that led to what happened in San Bernardino. And not only San Bernardino, but Orlando, because they're related to the same network. The very same network that the government shut down and deleted the information from the law enforcement system. On the 20th of February, new Secretary Kelly issued a directive saying that we were now going to bring the Privacy Right Act back into alignment with existing law, and that no longer would privacy rights be afforded to foreign nationals, lawful permanent residents, and/or to information in the law enforcement database. So if you're bringing something into alignment with the existing law, what does that mean? That it wasn't in alignment. So what that proves, my friends, is that I was investigated illegally by misuse of the Privacy Right Act by the Obama administration, who not only investigated me 9 times and shut down the Tablighi Jamaat case, but it removed the information from the system. And that means that they removed the information from the database illegally too. And so, for the last 3 years, Judicial Watch, and with my help, has been seeking FOIA documentation, Freedom of Information Act documentation, of the reasons why they shut down the Tablighi Jamaat case. And we've got 3 signed letters, one from the Department of Homeland Security, Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, the second one from DHS Customs and Border Protection, my agency, and the third one from the State Department, with signed letters of individuals in the current administration that said, we cannot provide you with any information from FOIA because we have no evidence that the case ever existed. When they are the ones who shut it down. Which means what? One of 2 things, neither one are good. Either they actually looked and couldn't find anything, which means what? Or B, they didn't really bother, they just said they did, which is bad as well. But in the back of the book, you'll notice there's a letter I received for commendation for the 300 terrorists related to specifically the Tablighi Jamaat case. So what we have here is a fundamental problem, friends. We have macro-level agencies insisting that no such case ever existed, when they are the ones that shut it down. Which means I am obligated by the vow that I took to stay in this fight until this thing becomes resolved, because I will make a declarative statement here, which means a statement is based on fact, it can be proven. If we don't resolve the decisions and policies and directives that went into the disconnect that led to San Bernardino and Orlando, then the inevitable consequence will be more attacks like the ones that we've already seen. So therefore, that's why I'm resolute to stay involved. So don't forget the PowerPoint, because there's a lot of stuff I didn't even touch on. And let's have a few questions, right? Thank you everyone for listening.
We'll direct questions for Phil Haney. Come down here to the front, and we'll try to get through them. And we appreciate your patience, and I think it's certainly worthwhile staying a little later to hear everything that you had to say. So, questions? Gail?
I have a question for you. Do you think that this terrorist group may be planning attacks on churches here in America?
Specifically, I don't know. But again, we're talking about the distinction between strategy and tactics. It's like the remote on a TV station. We need to take the remote and change it to the constitutional channel and then evaluate whatever these people are planning to do from that perspective, i.e., their intention is always going to be, whether it's peaceful or otherwise, to implement Sharia law. And that's the thing that we need to identify. The force of gravity that's pushing all of this is the same force of gravity, regardless of what target they may choose or pick any given time. But they certainly are in the Middle East, aren't they?
I know, certainly in Egypt.
Yes.
How would you go advise people out here who basically understand the threat, not as well as you, of course, to talk to somebody who doesn't? How do you move them from, on the information scale of a -3 up to an even or a +3?
Well, I'll use a biblical paraphrase. Always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within you. You can either address it from a political, secular, i.e. constitutional perspective, Article 6, or you can address it from a biblical perspective. And if you never open the Quran in your life, I'll tell you 3 things that if you know will make you immovable. Would you like to know them? The first one is that according to the Quran in chapter 4, Jesus was not crucified. There you have a fundamental point of conflict between the theology of Islam and the Bible, right? The second one is that Jesus Christ is not the Son of God, and to say so is blasphemy worthy of death. That's the second one. And the third one is, anybody know what the Paraclete, the Comforter, the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, the one that Jesus promised would come and walk beside us and never leave us or forsake us, is Muhammad. That he is the promised comforter that would come according to the prophecy in the Bible. So, is that true? How do you know it's not true? Because you understand the world from a biblical perspective, and very likely when you say so, you've had your own personal experience, right? You know. Therefore, you're immovable, as I said. And so if that's all you ever knew about the theology of Islam, not even counting Sharia, knowing those 3 things will make you immovable. And if you also master the Constitution, in particular the concepts embedded in Article 6, you are not only competent, but you're also confident. And as I said when I first started, doing what's right isn't so hard when you know what the right thing is.
Question?
Yes. Is there any such thing as a benign Muslim? And if so, what would be the litmus test?
I mean, is there such a thing as a moderate or a radical? The problem is they're subjective terms. You can't define them. It's like the taste of chocolate. How do you define the taste of chocolate? And today's moderate is tomorrow's radical, and today's radical is tomorrow's moderate. So really, the only basis you have for evaluating it is the standard is Sharia law. And somewhere in America, between 55 and 65% of the people living in the United States that are Muslim agree that Sharia law should be the law that they live under. And about half of them believe that use of violence is appropriate in order to implement or promote it. That's in the United States, which, by the way, isn't that much different than the rest of the world. So, the only way you're going to know is have a conversation or spend time observing or talking, and also be at the same time aware of what some of the more subtle aspects of Sharia law are. But for sure, you're not going to be a moderate Muslim except in liberal democratic cultures like ours, because in other parts of the world, you don't have the option. Ironically, it's only here where you can even choose. Anyone else?
We have so many leaders in our country who are willing to implement Sharia law. Are they naive? What is their motive?
To me, naivete is like a paper cup full of Diet Coke that you leave in your car for 2 or 3 days. And when you pick it up, the bottom falls out and you have a big nasty mess. You should know better. There's plenty of evidence by now that you don't put Coke in a paper cup and leave it in your car. That's what ignorance is. It won't hold water. And history does not permit that as an excuse that I didn't know, because think of the Germans. I didn't know. I didn't know that there were concentration camps. Does history accept that excuse? No. There's not just merely ignorance, it's more like willful blindness. And it is a bit of a mystery. It's kind of like a deception. Right now we're in a spasm of collective psychosis. Our whole country is in the grip of a psychosis right now.
On the radio show, we talked about on one hand, you have the fear of Islam and terrorism. On the other hand, fear of being called an Islamophobe. Islamophobia fear.
Yeah.
And what symbol goes between those two things?
It's a simple mathematical equation. Fear of being called a racist or an Islamophobe. Fear of attack. So, in your own mind, where do you think the mathematical symbol has been up to now? Greater than, less than, or equal? In other words, is our fear of being called an Islamophobe greater than, less than, or equal to our fear of an attack? What do you think it is? It's greater. Our fear of being called a racist Islamophobe is greater than our fear of an attack. Our own responses prove it. You know, actions speak louder than words. If the equation was reversed and our fear of attack, our concern, our preparation for, was greater than our concern about being branded as a racist or Islamophobe, we would respond in a totally different way to things like what happened in San Bernardino, rather than reflexively apologizing to the community that committed the crime and is swallowing it as though it was our fault somehow. And it's kind of like an abused woman whose husband beats her for burning the toast. Maybe tomorrow, if I just make the eggs and the toast a little better, he won't be angry and hit me. But it never works. There's always a reason. And so we have to change this thing around.
This could go on for several hours, you agree? As we think about what he has said, which is pretty deep, we need to digest it. And I would invite you, as many as would like, to hear him again tomorrow. Is that possible, Greg?
We can't, I mean, obviously, the person's house will not accommodate 200 people. But if you want to attend the private briefing tomorrow, come talk to me. If you know somebody who wouldn't be here, pastor, law enforcement, somebody who would benefit from hearing what Mr. Haney has to say, then you can come talk to us, and we'll get you the direction and the address and so on for the private briefing. Otherwise, the YouTube video is going to go up, and you can spread that. The radio show is this Saturday, 4 and 8 p.m. on AM 590. Then the podcast will be posted on the AM 590 website. Early next week, you can spread that and help spread his message. And of course, you can buy a copy of his book here tonight, and more than one copy. You can give people who might benefit from this a copy of his book. So there are many ways you can help get the word out of what Mr. Haney has to say. And we are way past time. John Barry.